I got pretty obsessed with the movie Backrooms. I saw it in theaters, then binged the web series, and then I saw the movie again, and I liked it even better the second time. I was fascinated by the choice to set Backrooms in the 90s, specifically the year 1990. Why did they do that? It's 2026 now, and enough time has passed for us to look at the 1990s as if it's really history. Backrooms reminded me of these video essays that I watched a few years back that talked about relics of the 90s, like dead malls, about how they symbolized the end of an era and kind of summed up everything that was wrong with consumer capitalism in the 21st century. Ugh, I know. But if you ask me, Backrooms is our first example of a full-fledged 21st century Gothic horror film. But it's not Gothic in that it's full of like Frankensteins or bats. Instead, it's full of haunted objects that represent a new type of Gothic. In this video, we'll explore the new Gothic, traveling to the edgelands of Great Britain, taking a peek inside the black box of the brain, taking a dip in something called Weird Space, and even making a quick stop in Twin Peaks. Grab your rope because we're diving into the Backrooms, but we're gonna come out because, as we will come to find, entering the Backrooms is a dangerous game. To me, Backrooms is a film about rumination and the dangers of getting too comfortable in a liminal space. These liminal spaces, like the Backrooms, are kind of like the shadows in the Victorian Gothic tradition. The longer things stay there, the more haunted they become. We talk about Gothic a lot on this channel. I think it's really important because art and aesthetics are basically our way of making sense of things that don't really make sense. They're the lens we use to make peace with history or society, with things outside of our control that can cause us stress. And the Gothic tradition is one of the oldest frameworks for examining otherness that exists in the Western world. We're seeing more and more Gothic these days. Frankenstein and Wuthering Heights are both classic Gothic novels. When the days get dark, the dark gets Gothic. The first coming of Gothic is associated with the Middle Ages, when the word Gothic was used to describe the tribal architecture that invaded Europe after the fall of Rome. This is where we get things like gargoyles, cathedrals, and expressions of otherness that tried to make a sort of peace with fear. The second and probably the most popular iteration of Gothic came in the 1800s, when the Gothic novel again captured the feeling of living with fear. The world was industrializing, and everyone was dying of tuberculosis. Nature was disappearing, and things were getting more and more connected through railroads and travel. Gothic novels dealt with subjects like queerness, otherness, mental illness, or forbidden desires, things that this strict society pushed into the shadows where they grew and turned into monsters. A harsh environment like a haunted house or a wind-beaten crag was often used as a metaphor for the character's own inner turmoil. Believe it or not, Wuthering Heights is supposed to be a Gothic ghost story about repressed trauma, but that's another video essay. The Victorian era also gave us these Victorian mansions, which were opulent displays of often ill-gotten wealth. As these mansions decayed, they became the settings for 20th century Gothic stories like Psycho or Tales from the Crypt. This video essay on opulence says the new Gothic sensibility is the decaying carcass of 21st century consumerism. It's not an accident that the Backrooms takes place inside of a retail store. It's a consumer space. There's actually already a term for horror set in modern liminal spaces. It's what the British writer Marion Chouard calls edgelands Gothic. She uses this term to describe the rotting post-industrial wastelands between British suburbs. The edgelands are raw and rough, and rather than seeming people-friendly, are often somber and menacing, flaunting their participation in activities we do not wholly understand. The second time I saw Backrooms, it was in the same plaza as this Bed Bath & Beyond that had been abandoned for years. I was so struck by how much the inside of this store looked like the Backrooms, even down to that weird yellow tinge. In America, edgeland spaces look like abandoned big box stores and shopping malls, which needed a lot of space to get built in the first place. But once they're abandoned, they literally become a waste of space. Dead shopping malls and gutted big box stores deserve every symbolic comparison they get. They are relics of middle-class prosperity, casualties of e-commerce, shrines to consumerism that maybe should never have existed in the first place. It all boils down to a glorification of capitalism, something that was all-consuming during the 1990s.
With Mall Madness, you get it all. A bank account and your own credit card.
It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. These are the opening words of Capitalist Realism by the British economist and author Mark Fisher. This is a work that examines how capitalism flattened and arguably destroyed modern culture. This clip is from Roy Deschanel's excellent video essay called Love at the End of History.
In 1992, political scientist Francis Fukuyama said that history as we knew it was coming to an end. The Berlin Wall had just fallen, and so had communism. Liberal democracy and capitalism had triumphed the day. In Fukuyama's bleary eyes, change was a thing of the past. Capitalism was the beginning, but it was also the end. All the impassioned ideological debates, revolutionary battles, and major paradigm shifts would cease to exist in this new world order. The only ideology left was the market.
In the 90s, the rise of global capitalism and the flood of technology that connected everyone flattened the world like never before. In the Victorian times, it was the railroads. In modern times, it's the internet. The 90s gave us the personal computer, the cell phone, the internet, and a panic known as Y2K, when all this technology was supposedly going to fail.
Survivalists stockpiled food and everyone waited to see what would shut down when the clock struck midnight in the new millennium.
I don't remember Y2K, but I kind of see it like the COVID that never came. I think it expressed how overwhelmed people felt with all this new technology. In the Backrooms opening mini-movie, a flustered character confronts a pile of floppy disks with a video camera, which are both deliciously outdated technologies. Backrooms' scare structure implies that garbage is scary. Taking something out of context makes you see it differently. What once seemed useful now seems scary now that it's useless. Showard uses cars as an example. She says advertisements show cars in pristine form. In a scrapyard, we see how they break, how they crumple and go rusty. In doing so, we may find it easier to break free of their stranglehold over our lives and our environment. I love that Showard makes the analysis that some technology is bad for us and bad for our environment. What is the price that we pay for this usefulness? Do we need to adopt absolutely every new technology? The Backrooms are also a metaphor for the human mind, and using settings to externalize the internal is a really Gothic thing. The puzzle of the human brain is something Gothic authors have played with for centuries, and that brings us to the edge of the Edgelands, where we will find weird space. You know that girl who's always talking to herself at lunchtime? She's so weird. Well, it's not exactly the kind of weird that we mean. One definition of weird is things that can't be explained by science, but they almost can. Mark Fisher, the same guy behind Capitalist Realism, wrote another book called The Weird and the Eerie, where he talks about weird space. It's basically this liminal wasteland/wonderland where science almost works, but doesn't.
Watch the square. Look at that! Gone!
I really love how in the activation section of all the Backrooms videos, there's always some sort of scientific method. The character tapes off a space where the normal rules of the physical world do not apply. There's usually an exploratory phase and some sort of hypothesis that gets tested, like, can you come back? Eventually, the characters start documenting their findings with floor plans and murals. And there's even this whole organization dedicated to studying the Backrooms. They used to make MRI machines. That's a real science, which implies that these people have scientific minds. The concept of weirdness sprung up around the Industrial Revolution, when science was making discoveries so fantastic they might as well be magic. You're telling me you can shoot a tiny bit of serum into somebody's arm and they're not going to get tuberculosis for the rest of their life? That's pretty incredible. The actual discoveries of science led writers to imagine things even more unbelievable, like dinosaurs at the center of the earth, or a scientist who makes animal-human hybrids and teaches them how to govern themselves. The first coming of the weird is collected in periodicals like Weird Tales or the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft, who's still a popular source of science fiction these days, called the weird a suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature, which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. Things are really scary when they have some origin in the reality that we accept. Cthulhu is scary because it looks like an octopus. The color out of space is scary because the northern lights are real. My mom told me this one time when the northern lights came to her town, the little neighbor boy went around banging on everybody's door saying, "The aliens are coming, the aliens are coming." It's not the aliens, but it is pretty unbelievable. The parallels between the Backrooms and the brain are pretty in your face. The human brain is known as the black box. There's no way to see inside. And even after a century of study, we're pretty much limited to experiments in the field of psychology when it comes to studying the brain and human behavior. MRI machines scan brains, but even then they're limited to reading electromagnetic activity, which only says so much. But you could see how some MRI guys would get excited about the Backrooms. The therapist, who's a psychologist, basically gives up, deciding survival is more important than studying the brain. Mark Fisher says the uncanny puts the strange within the familiar and operates by always processing the outside through the gaps and impasses of the inside. The weird and the eerie allow us to see the inside from the perspective of the outside. That's the perspective that Mary has in Backrooms. She might think she's seeing the inside of Clark's mind, but really she's seeing inside everyone's mind. There is nothing more fascinating than the organ that shapes our perception of the world. Who even knows if we're seeing things that are really there, or if we all just have brains that are programmed to see the same wrong things in the exact same ways? In the Backrooms, the Mark Duplass character says, "I'm convinced that nothing in our lifetime, nothing in maybe all of recorded history means more than this." He's talking about the brain, and you know what? I agree.
It's May 12, 2020, and it's a Tuesday.
Okay, I've been dying to talk about David Lynch since this video started. David Lynch was an acclaimed surrealist director who's known for works like Twin Peaks, Mulholland Drive, and Eraserhead. His works explore fractured realities, memory, horror, trauma, and ultimately the power of the human brain to rationalize and overcome these things.
And all this should burn off later, and we'll have sunshine around 71 degrees Fahrenheit. Have a great day, everyone.
David Lynch died last year as a direct result of the Los Angeles wildfires. David Lynch lived in the Hollywood Hills, which were burning, and due to medical conditions, he could not evacuate. He had emphysema, so he probably wasn't long for this world even before the wildfires, but I thought I'd at least get to see him do a Q&A or something before he died. And ever since he died, I've wondered, who's gonna pick up the linchpin? In his movie Wild at Heart, Laura Dern's character Lula says the whole world is wild at heart and weird on top.
This whole world's wild at heart and weird on top.
Well, what's above the heart? The brain. And we've already talked about how the brain is weird, and exploring the brain is weird, and leads us on a journey where we may never reach the end, and maybe we're not designed to. That's kind of the point of the Backrooms. They suck you in and you get stuck there, wandering around. It grows as you explore it, until soon you're out of touch with reality and obsessed with the Backrooms. Sure, the Backroom setting looks freaking incredible, but it's also nostalgic. In her excellent novel Ghosts, Dolly Alderton writes that nostalgia comes from a Greek word which means pain from an old wound. Nostalgia is fun, but it can also hurt us. Remember, perception is reality. I don't super want to talk about Kane Parsons' young age, but I do think it's very interesting that he chose to set this movie in a fairly recent version of the past that he nevertheless did not live through. They nail the aesthetic of the 90s so well it's almost creepy. In Twin Peaks and in a lot of David Lynch's work, there's this sort of nostalgia for the 1950s that also says something about that era and the era in which David is making the work. The 1950s were this seemingly idyllic time where everything was perfect, but there also seemed to be some sinister undercurrents lurking just below the surface. In a way, the central thesis of Backrooms is the same as the thesis of Twin Peaks. There's a shadow reality just inches from the one we know. But the more we mess around with it, the more we get stuck there. And it's not a nice place. I know no one will ever know what Twin Peaks is really about, even David Lynch, and could really explain it. But in a way, that's the whole point. It's not a destination, it's a playground. But you have to come up for air eventually. Otherwise, you'll never make it out alive. While I was researching this video, it broke my heart to learn that Mark Fisher, who did so much writing and thinking on this subject, died at age 48 from self-inflicted causes. He was quoted as saying, "The pandemic of mental anguish that afflicts our time cannot be properly understood or healed if viewed as a private problem suffered by damaged individuals." I have to say, especially when examining things that are broken, deteriorating, and disgusting, I do have to wonder, is the way we're going really the best way for us to go? To me, the Backrooms is asking these questions. The Backrooms absolutely fits the Gothic definition of weird. It's science adjacent, but cautious. And as our science becomes even more freaking scary, I think we're gonna see a lot more Gothic stories exploring these themes. But remember, folks, no future is inevitable. The groundbreaking scientific experiments in medicine from the Victorian times usually involve digging up corpses or killing people specifically to study them. We don't really do that anymore. And remember, the success of an invention comes not just from its existence, but from its adoption. Just because we can doesn't mean we should put a Tesla in space. We can choose to leave technology that harms us in this liminal space of the 2020s, stuck between the floors and ceilings of time, just like furniture in the Backrooms. Thank you everybody so much for being here and for watching. I've had a lot of misgivings about making YouTube videos in the era of AI and data scraping, but it means a lot to me that you're all here, and thank you for all the great person-to-person interactions. As always, please engage, leave a comment. Tell me something that Backrooms reminded you of. I had a friend tell me that it reminded her of the H.P. Lovecraft story In the Witch's House, which I'm super excited to read. And thanks for stopping by. Oh, hi, Mark. Take care, everybody.